Welcome again, everybody, to the Fall 2020 Faculty Forum. It's really a pleasure to have all of you here, and certainly it's really a pleasure and an honor to have our speaker today. Our speaker here today is Dr. Work, and Dr. Mao has over 15 years of experience working with marginalized young people as an advocate, a trainer, a program developer, and a coordinator, and certainly as a researcher in Missoula, Montana, and in St. Paul, Minnesota. Her other practice areas include organizational and community change and culturally informed services and interventions. Her research interests are related to Hmong American youth, oral traditions, and indigenous methodologies. So thank you for joining us. The platform is all yours, Kao Nou. Thank you.
Great, thanks so much. I'm going to share my screen, and hopefully you are able to see my screen, but with just the visuals. And I think I'm getting a thumbs up. It says yes, great. And hopefully you don't see my notes. That's why I'm hopeful there. And hopefully you can still see everything, and then hopefully someone will come on if something disappears. So again, thank you for joining me this afternoon, and thank you to our SP for the opportunity to present today. I was scheduled to present in the spring, but I'm happy to again get the opportunity to do so this fall. So in today's presentation, I will be presenting a set of findings related to a much larger study on how young Hmong American women conceptualize youth. In other words, what does being a young person mean for Hmong American youth? So in terms of the overview for the presentation, I will provide a literature review. So just to situate the study for listeners today, I'll then talk about the methodology and more specifically about this idea of centering Hmong ways of knowing. Then present the findings. What does it mean to be ituloa, or a young person? And then lastly, I'll discuss a few implications. What do these findings mean for social work practice? So before I begin, I want to provide a very brief history, and I want to say brief again, just so that folks who are not familiar with Hmong history have some knowledge. So Hmong originally lived throughout China, and after many years of conflict, Hmong were forced to move into southern China. And eventually, by the 1800s, we had Hmong folks who were eventually fled into Southeast Asia. By the 1960s, Hmong in Southeast Asia became entangled with U.S. foreign policy, and many Hmong in Laos aligned themselves with the U.S. and then were eventually recruited by the CIA to fight in what we now know as the secret war in Laos to contain the spread of communism. When the U.S. pulled forces out of Southeast Asia, Hmong became targets, forcing many Hmong families to flee Laos. And then by the late 1970s, Hmong resettled throughout the world. And then in the last census, there were a little bit over 47,000 Hmong folks in Wisconsin. And Wisconsin is the third largest Hmong population in the United States. So as I mentioned, I want to situate the study, so I want to provide a little bit of context for this study. And in doing so, I actually want to talk about a previous study. So several years ago, I conducted a critical discourse analysis of 25 years of academic literature. And the purpose of that study was to better understand how Hmong youth have been portrayed in academic literature. And so from that particular study, I developed 3 portraits of how Hmong American youth have been portrayed over the last 25 years. And so in the 1980s, what we see in the academic literature is that Hmong American youth were often referred to as the Hmong, and so there was a lot of the process of othering. We saw in the literature also researchers who were using Hmong and the word refugees interchangeably, and so that Hmong became synonymous with refugees and refugees became synonymous with Hmong. There was also a real focus on the problems, not only the problems that Hmong American youth were bringing to the United States during resettlement in terms of, experiences of war and trauma and PTSD, experiences of living in refugee camps, but also focusing on the problems that Hmong American youth were experiencing primarily in educational settings, right? And so lots of focus on ESL, a focus on underachievement, focus on the barriers related to language and culture. In the 1990s, we saw a trend, a different trend, still a lot of focus on the differences and the difficulties, but we started to better understand the process of acculturation that many Hmong American youth were experiencing. And here, there were several articles that highlighted just how different the Hmong American youth experience was from other groups that had resettled during that time. And they really highlighted, the involvement in gangs, the dropout rates, the underachievement of Hmong American youth, and again, really focused on, how well Hmong American youth were adjusting to the United States. By the early 2000s, we saw a slight shift. More researchers became interested in this idea of identity. What does it mean to be both Hmong and American? And we still saw, lots of research related to acculturation and conflict. And that conflict was really situated around understanding the relationships between parents and children. And so looking at intergenerational conflict among families. And so, as I conducted this study here, what I was noticing is that a lot of that early research is what Eve Tuck describes as damage-centered research. And damage-centered research is research that oftentimes documents the pain and loss of a community. It uses historical exploitation to explain contemporary brokenness rather than acknowledging that there are current contemporary policies and practices that continue to exploit these communities. And it also points to oppression as the single thing that defines that community. And so Eve Tuck proposes a different way of conducting research or doing research within these communities. And so Tuck proposes what she calls a desire-based framework. And this framework has three major components. This is about looking at the complexity, looking at the contradictions, and then looking at the self-determination of lived lives. And so I knew that I wanted to use this desire-based framework in a study to better understand the experiences of Hmong American youth. In addition to Eve Tuck's desire-based framework, I also wanted to center Hmong ways of inquiry, and in particular, utilize indigenous methodologies. Indigenous methodologies is defined as privileging and centering indigenous worldviews, values, and knowledge. And in this particular study, I privileged and centered Hmong worldviews, values, and knowledge. And so as I was thinking about, how might I integrate Hmong values and knowledge and worldviews, I looked to Karina Walter's work. And she developed this concept called retraditionalization. And retraditionalization is a process in which you look at, the communities and see what are traditional or cultural protocols that exist within those communities that you might retraditionalize in the research process. So as I was thinking about the methodology or how I might go about conducting this study, I asked myself two questions. How have Hmong asked questions, and how have Hmong sought answers? And so, I sort of went through a bunch of different cultural protocols and processes that exists within Hmong communities. And I wanted to find one that I could re-traditionalize for this research project. And so I settled on the process that a Hmong shaman undertakes when they are seeking healing for an individual. And fortunately for me, my mother is a shaman, and so I grew up having seen this process quite a bit. And so I knew from what I observed, and then in addition, I also asked my mother more questions about this particular process. And so this process, when an individual is seeking healing for an illness or related to well-being, they oftentimes seek a shaman who they have a relationship with. And so it's oftentimes someone who they are related to, someone who lives within their community, someone who is a distant relative or a relative of a relative. But I knew that in my recruitment, relationships had to be key. And so when I set out my recruitment, I reached out to a bunch of different organizations which I had relationships with people in those organizations. I also did a lot of recruitment through friends and family. And I utilized a purposeful sampling method. In addition to indigenous methods, I'll add that I also used another methodology called portraiture, which closely resembles ethnography and phenomenology. So I had 8 participants, and that small sample size is appropriate for that methodology. And I knew that I wanted to interview people who identified as young, people who identified as Hmong American, and people who identified as women. My other research question that is a completely different would be a different presentation was I was also interested in the role of oral tradition. And so I wanted to interview or recruit participants who were who were engaged in some storytelling practices. And so so I had very purposeful sampling in terms of who was involved in this study. The second phase of the cultural protocol is when the shaman actually seeks the answers. And in Hmong, we call this Shaineng, is a process that a shaman undertakes to try to find answers and then to try to figure out what's the healing ceremony, what that might look like. And so in that process of Shaineng, the shaman uses multiple tools to gather information. And I knew that this idea of multiple tools would be really important for me as I thought about data collection. And so I used a variety of different ways to collect data. The primary data collection method that I used was in-depth interviews. And these interviews were oftentimes bilingual in Hmong and in English. I also observed different kinds of storytelling. I have observed in quotations here because I had folks who were public performers, so I would go and watch their performances, or I had folks who were vloggers and bloggers and fashion designers, and so I would go to their websites, or they would send me photos of things that they had produced, and so I observed their storytelling practices that way. I also journaled quite a bit and practiced reflexivity. This was important for me as a researcher because of my own identity. At one time I identified as a young person, and I also identify as a Hmong woman, and I wanted to make sure that what my participants were sharing with me were reflective of their own experience and not necessarily my lens on their experience. The next process of my mother's protocol that I retraditionalized, so the oneng or the hupli part, which is the actual healing ceremony. And so I thought about data analysis as a ritual. And I used a pretty standard qualitative thematic analysis of coding. So I read the transcripts, I listened to the audio recordings, I read through my own journal entries and field notes. It was this constant comparison. And I thought of that data analysis as a ritual. And the last piece of the protocol is a celebration. And once that healing ceremony is over, once that that person feels healed, then there is some celebration, and that celebration includes community. And so I knew that in my dissemination, I had to think about this idea of community. And so I've always, for me, doing this research within my own community has been to return this knowledge to my communities. And so I've done that through different presentations, including this one, and then others that are less academic. And then also something that I've valued and is a cultural value within Hmong communities is this idea of reciprocity. And so I've have been able to maintain mutual relationships with folks who've been involved with this study. And that has been important for me as I think about, future research. So that's the methodology for, how you went about to collect the data. So what does this all mean? What does it mean to be Ituhlua? So what were the findings? So I'll tell you that it's pretty nuanced in terms of what it means to be a young person in Hmong American communities. And there were 3 themes that really emerged, and I'm going to present the themes here, and then I'll talk in depth about each of them in a moment, and then actually share with you some, some of the stories and experiences that my participants shared with me. So the 3 themes were around cultural and linguistic aspects of what it means to be a young person, certainly the lived experiences of young people, of what it means to be young, and then I also noticed this theme that I entitled Navigating and Negotiating, and it really touches on how almost on a daily basis young people have to navigate and negotiate and make decisions about what it means to be a young person. So now, I want to, again, I'll go through each of these more in depth. So in terms of the language or the culture and the language, when I asked the question, what does it mean to be Ituhlua, or what does it mean to be a young person? Many of my participants, the first thing they pointed to was cultural markers. And one of the most consistent ones that they shared was around marriage. That marriage oftentimes defined Ituhlua, a young person, from Itulau, which is an older person. And so, marriage was that one cultural marker that oftentimes separated young people from older people. And yet, all of my participants said it was also situational and highly contextual. So in any given room, right, if you do have a partner and you are married, you still may be Ituhlua, you may still be a young person. Depending on, how you figure out your relationships, right? And so that's the language piece is, a lot of the words that Hmong people use, especially our kinship terms, is really about identifying who's older and who's younger. And so even in the language that we use to describe siblings or, relatives, we oftentimes indicate who's older and who's younger. And one of the young women shared with me this quote here. She says, most of the time, young people have to listen to those who are older than them, like older siblings or adults. You have to be very respectful. And so, we see kinship terms show up as a way to be respectful. And then the last piece of this culture and language, and I wasn't exactly sure how this would fit, but of all the themes, this seemed to fit most closely here is, many of them talked more about being a young person as a state of being or a feeling or an emotion. And one young woman told me, she said, personally, I know I am young, but I feel old. I think it's due to all the experiences that you always take on an older person's mentality. I feel old, but physically I am young. Maybe the feeling matters more. The second theme was around lived experiences, and what I learned while listening to these young women share with me their experiences that as that they have some real lived experiences that have been hurtful and painful, especially from people within their community and with folks who they have pretty important relationships with. One young woman shared with me that, oftentimes when she's with older adults and is asked about decisions that she's making about life. She tells me that you have to hold your tongue, right? This experience of making a decision to not to say something. Another woman shared with me that as a young person, she was told or hushed quite a bit, especially from her grandmother, who she spent quite a bit of time with, and how painful that experience of being hushed was. And then I had another young woman who shared with me just how she received really mixed messages about being a young person, and when she, was asked her opinion, and when she was no longer people didn't want her opinion. And she shared it with me in an interaction that she had with her father, who would say things to her like, "You are of age already. You should know better." And then she said, and then her father would say, "But when it comes to very serious stuff, they look at you like you are still a child." And her father would say, "You don't know any better. Why do you keep talking?" Right? And so again, experiences that have been pretty painful and hurtful, especially from people, adults, who these young people have really important relationships with. And then the next theme was around navigating and negotiating. And I decided to break up these this particular theme just so I can highlight what I mean when I say navigating, what it means to be a young person, and then what I mean when I say negotiating, what it means to be a young person. So when I talk about navigating, what I notice is that it was very difficult for young people to just talk about what it meant to be a young person and not think about intersectionality, right? And not think about what it meant to be a young person and Hmong women, or a young person and someone who was born in the refugee camps and then moved here as a child, or someone who was a young person and grew up with, second generation Hmong parents, right? And so they have a very different acculturation process, or are more assimilated. And then, of course, talking to many of these women who were first generation, and how, the experiences that they had. And so I want to read to you two quotes that I think are pretty profound. When I interviewed them about, how do they make sense of their identities, and then how do they navigate those intersecting identities. And so one young woman shared with me, in terms of the intersectionality of gender and age, said, "So it's almost like they've given me two plates to work from, and to make sure I balance both, but also try to prioritize one plate over the other." And I love this image of the balancing of the plates, because you hear then the expectations that young people have, right? The expectation to balance the plates, but at any given moment be able to prioritize one or the other, right? And how challenging that might be for a young person, and how challenging that might be for them to make sense of this particular metaphor. Another really profound and compelling story that a young woman shared with me was around being a first generation student, and the immense, sort of the contradictory and complex emotions that she experienced. And she said, she shared with me, "I felt like I was moving forward, whereas my family was not. I was really sad. I wasn't proud of myself. I always have this guilty feeling that I wasn't able to pull my family with me. And I'm like going forward and thinking, I don't think this is fair." And I found this story so, as I said, compelling, because I think it really speaks to Eve Tuck's desire-based framework, right? That idea that these young people have pretty complex lives, and yet this is the lived reality of these young individuals. And then the last theme, as I shared, is negotiating. And so lots and lots of young people shared with me this great responsibility that they had. And when they talked about the responsibility, most often they shared with me a real sense of pride, how proud they were to be the ones, right, who were to, as one woman told me, carry on the stories of their community. And I had a young woman share with me, this is a fashion designer, and she, does a lot of mixing traditional pieces with more contemporary ideas when it comes to fashion. And she said to me, I think as a young person, that's why I do the things that I do. It's because I'm doing whatever I can to hold my hand out to the past, to our history, and to our traditions, while reaching to the future. I think we all experience this pull and stretch of holding on to what has always been and making room for it in the future. And as I think about that particular quote, right, I know that, many of the young women who I interviewed, they see themselves as being quite committed to their communities. And so they see themselves as artists, as organizers, as activists, as advocates, as liaisons, like trying to, lots of them talked about straddling these, the American world and the Hmong world, right? And so, yes, there is a great amount of pride, but if you can imagine the amount of stress involved, right, in trying to, and this is the piece here, negotiate between the pride and the stress, right, of being a young person. And the last quote I'll share with you before I go into the implications is that I think does a really great job of that exemplifies that desire-based framework. And so a woman shared with me, to be ituhloa, or a young person in the Hmong community, is to be someone with a lot of struggles, but also to be someone with a lot of love for the world so that they can change, so that they can make changes to the environment that they live in and to the community that they love. And so, again, I think this quote does a great job of exemplifying that desire-based framework, of really highlighting the complexity, the contradictions, and the self-determination of these young people's lives. And so what does that mean for social work? In terms of implications for practice. And so I want to share with you just a few things that I've been thinking about as a social worker. So in terms of practice and policies, I think often of Marsiglia and Kulis's work, they're social workers. They coined the term culturally grounded social work. And so I think often of the programs that I used to coordinate and that I used to develop, and all of those programs that I used to coordinate were oftentimes based on the research from those early studies, right? And so a lot of the programs that I ran were about academic achievement or about college prep. We were oftentimes funded by gang and drug prevention money. And I did a lot of work around cultural preservation. And so what I would love to see in terms of, what these findings mean is that that we really do culturally grounded programs and organizational policies. As social workers, oftentimes what happens is we develop a program, and then when we're taking it to a new population or to a new community, we just adapt that program. But rather, Marsiglia and Kulis really advocate this idea of how do we build programs and policies from the grounds of that particular culture or community. And so some specific ways I see that is developing programs that are based on intergenerational relationships. Many of the literature really points to how disengaged young people are. And yet, when I interviewed young people, many of them talked about how important and how crucial intergenerational relationships have been for them, that having grandparents and parents who were mentors and teachers were for their own development and then their own appreciation of who they were, who they are, and their culture. I also think that policies ought to reflect cultural values, both in program policies, but organizational policies as well. And then the last thing I'll touch on is around further research. As I shared with you, my sample size was fairly small, but appropriate for that particular methodology. But I'd love to expand the sample size and perhaps do some mixed methods to better describe the experiences of young Hmong Americans. And then I would like to see some additional research related to those intergenerational relationships. I'm interested in particular around intergenerational storytelling and how young people and older adults can work together. And then lastly, interested in doing youth participatory action research, or YPAR, that really looks to young people as co-researchers or collaborators, that we can build the capacity within these communities so that they can then do research that is relevant to their communities and then relevant to their lives. So I know we're running out of time. I wish I could talk more about all of this, but I think I was also told to save some room for questions. I do have my email address here too, so I'm open to answering any questions now. But if you have questions that you want to follow up, you can also email me. So I will go ahead and stop sharing. And Catherine, will you moderate this next piece if there's questions? Or
Yeah, great. Yeah, thank you very much, Kao Nou, for a wonderful presentation. Very inspiring. So for questions, there are two methods. If folks want to directly ask a question, I would ask you to use the raise the hand button. The raise the hand button can be found under people. If you click on the icon people, towards the bottom, there's a button called raise the hand. If you press on that, you can, I will, as a moderator, I can call on you and you can ask the question directly. Or alternatively, if you'd like to type your question into the chat box, the chat function is also on the upper right-hand corner of your screen. I can also relay the question to Kao Nou. So whichever method works best for you, please have the questions coming. We have a question from Alicia, I believe.
Yes.
Right? Alicia, you can unmute.
Okay, thank you. Kao Nou, as you were doing your research, and especially as you were talking with folks about their experiences, did that bring up any difficult feelings for you, and how did you navigate that?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I think, for me, as I mentioned, this is, I'm from this community and, have identities that are very similar with the participants. And so I did a lot of journaling. And again, that was for me to be transparent about what I was noticing for myself, but also in the data analysis, making sure that it wasn't my experience that I was completely using to see the experiences of in the data, right? And so that also was helpful because then I this was my dissertation research. And so I had my faculty advisor who is a white man, who is not Hmong, who is not a woman, who was helpful to keep me in check, right? To say, is this you or is this the person, right? And then when is it appropriate for it to be both of us, right? Because I was also really interested in this idea of co-constructing because of my interest in storytelling, right? And so I wanted to be pretty transparent, and so journaling helped a lot, and then also talking to my advisor was really helpful, just so that when we were doing research, in talking about that Ime perspective versus that Edic perspective, right? Being really mindful that it isn't my story, right? But it is the stories and experiences of the participant.
Excellent. Thank you.
Thanks.
Any other questions for Kao Nou? You have a comment from Leah, but I also see a new question now in the chat box. It says, what do majority of the students have in common when dealing with higher education and their identity?
What I got, so most of the women, I would say, actually all of the women who I interviewed were either in school or had graduated. And many of them, I think, experience a lot of what a lot of first-generation students experience, which is being expected to be successful in a setting in which they have very little support, or parents don't always know how to support them. And so feeling very stressed about that, but knowing that they have to do well, or feeling an expectation to do well. And so I think that quote that I read from that young woman about just sort of this sense of guilt of like, her life will be drastically different from her parents, and maybe that is her parents' desire, is that their children's lives are different than their parents' lives, but for them not or making sense of that. And I think we have to remember that these are 18-year-olds, right, who are talking about trying to make sense of like this great expectation, but then also making sense of the great amount of stress and pressure that they experience to be successful, and not having all of the tools or resources to be successful. Thanks, Gomeng, for the question.
And I believe we have another question from Lisa. Lisa, please.
Kao Nou, I was wondering, when you did recruiting, since in general it's not really about a number, youth isn't about a number, right? Like 18. How did you recruit when you said young people? So how were there certain words, or how did you frame the recruiting about what young meant?
Yeah, so for the purposes of getting IRB approval, he said that they had to be over 18. And that was through consulting with my advisor and others on my committee who just knew that it would be difficult to try to get parent permission and all of that, and so I decided on 18, but I still had people who would message me and say, well, I'm 25. Does that count as young? And so for me, it was then having a discussion with people who, and that same question about youth and what it means to be a young person. And then and also when I had the question around, I wanted people to be engaged in storytelling. And a lot of them talked about, I do this, but is it storytelling? And so it was those similar conversations of, what does being a young person mean to you, or what does storytelling mean to you? And then so I had a lot of conversations with people, and that's what these interviews ended up being, which were more conversational than it was sort of question answer. But I did have to field a lot of interest from people who weren't sure if they were considered a young person. And that made it more, I think, that made them more interested in the project too, of like, oh, this is what you're trying to answer, right, in this study. And so that also then, for them, they were then more interested in the study after having that conversation.
Thanks a lot, Kao Nou. So in a sense,
Yeah.
you possibly were restrained by rules of IRB, right?
Yeah.
And but thank you for answering that. That's interesting.
Yeah, thanks. And I think, and that's probably the next, when I talk about expanding the sample size, right? And I think that's an area that we can, because a lot of the stories that the young women shared with me were more about reflecting on growing up right, in their homes, or when their experiences in middle school or high school. So I think that might be the important next step, is to think about how do I expand the sample size and think about recruiting those who are under 18.
Great discussion. Thank you, everybody. Well, just to be mindful of time, I would encourage you all to continue the discussion, but perhaps offline. So I'd like to thank, of course, everybody for coming, especially our speaker, Kao Nou. Thanks for sharing your expertise, and thank you, everybody, for participating. And I hope to see you all next week. Okay, bye.
Great.
Take
Thank
care.
you.